Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out in such numbers on a Friday at the end of March, beginning of April, which is like the start of the exhausting period of the spring semester. I'm Stefano Ziarulanos. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the Remarque Institute, and it is my great pleasure today to be introducing for the second time already today Dagmar Herzog. And welcoming you and her to the Remarque Institute. Together with me, there's also Amy Nguyen, Haley Ackerman, and Sam Paul, who have organized the long marathon of a day around Dagmar's work. And it's a real delight to be able to hear something about her, or not even just something, an overview of her new project. So, Dagmar Herzog is one, if not the leading historian at the intersection of virtually half the fields that matter in European history in general. The history of sex in Europe, German history, the history of the Holocaust and of its memory or memories, the theory and practice of psychoanalysis, the relationship between emotions and politics, the history of eugenics, which is especially significant in her subject today in terms of eugenics and disability. She is a distinguished professor of history and the Daniel Rose Faculty Scholar at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and the author of at least, by my count, 7 books. Intimacy and Exclusion, Religious Politics in Pre-Revolutionary Baden from 1996. The blockbuster Sex After Fascism, Memory and Morality in 20th Century Germany. Sex and Crisis, The New Sexual Revolution and the Future of American Politics from 2008. Sexuality in Europe, A 20th Century History from 2011. Sorry that I have to just like list them, but it's like the fastest way to do this somehow. And you get a sense of so much just from the titles in this. Cold War Freud, Psychoanalysis in an Age of Catastrophes from 2016. And Unlearning Eugenics, Sexuality, Reproduction, and Disability in Post-Nazi Europe from 2018. She has edited more books still than that, including most recently with Chelsea Shields, The Routledge Companion to Sexuality and Colonialism, which came out of Routledge in 2021. An edition of Fritz Morgenthaler's On the Dialectics of Psychoanalytic Practice, which she edited and introduced from 2020. The book of essays by Anson Rabenbach, Staging the Third Reich, that we did together. Also from Routledge in 2020. And I want to mark, together with the Morgenthaler, also that she did a special issue of Psychoanalysis and History and Sophie Becker, because this has very much to do with the way in which she is pulling out figures, let's say, too easily getting forgotten from the history of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic practice. Indeed, she has been editor of Psychoanalysis and History, I think about to pass the baton, or just passed?
Already passed.
Okay. After a decade in this position, and has also been very much involved in the Journal of the History of Sexuality and related journals. This kind of generosity toward other scholars is something that those of you who know her already will know really particularly well. Now, as per the title of one of her essays, she's a historian of how pleasure, sex, and politics go together, frequently and emphatically with a focus on the cruelty and active forgetting that have been involved in, through them in establishing the politics of extermination in the 20th century. She's an historian of morality, and as I said this morning, an immensely important intellectual historian. Sex After Fascism was really a social history of ideas while pretending not to be one, and a historian of the ways that sex, race, and class translate into one another frequently in ways that are not much seen. Among her many honors, I want to mention 2. The first is that in Germany, she has given the Magnus Hirschfeld Lecture twice.
Lectures, I keep having to point that out.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean that you just like reappeared after a while and said like actually giving the exact same words will be something. But also that in, I think, 2021, she gave the Adorno Lectures at the University of Frankfurt, which is especially important in our case because the project she is presenting today is a fully fleshed out version of what she first spoke about in the Adorno Lectures. Today's title is Eugenic Phantasms, Intellectual Disability and German History. Please join me in welcoming Dagmar Herzog to Remarque.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so enormously much for being here. I deeply, deeply appreciate it. And I am in the process of having finished that table of contents, all those components, except for the conclusion, which I'm having terrible trouble with. I've drafted it multiple times and I still need help, but I'm also going to make little tiny changes before I hand it in. So I'm very interested in critical feedback and suggestions for things I need to think about more. So the book as a whole, the larger project, traces not so much paradigm shifts as what I would call paradigm struggles over the value of disabled life, specifically cognitively disabled life, from the 1870s to the 2020s, charting the pre and post history of what we now come to understand as Nazism's first genocide. There are a few overall points, I think 7 or so, that I'm trying to convince everyone of. I'm just going to say them up front before I cut into what's going to be a version of chapter 2, Love, Money, Murder. So point number 1, which holds true for the entire story, the 150 years, is poverty produces disability, including 85% or more of intellectual disability, not heredity. So random accidents, during pregnancy or around birth or early childhood diseases can also cause intellectual disability, but the vast majority of what got marked as feeble-minded in the past was caused by conditions of poverty. Number 2, as a result, disability education and care are therefore inextricable in every era from poverty management, and thus from class conflict and class warfare. 3, much of the drama of the story, and you'll see this when I talk about the 1920s today, turns on the question of ability or inability to work, making a labor contribution, a productive contribution to one's society, to the point where biopolitics, the Foucault term, might better be thought of as bioeconomics. But simultaneously, there is definitely always an emotional element, what Raymond Williams called, quote, a structure of feeling that we have to pay attention to in writing the story. It's manifest in all the battles over the worth of disabled lives. There's questions of love and attachment and affection value, as it were, to disgust, ambivalence, defensiveness, shame, and contamination, even just being in proximity to the topic. That was true in the past, and it's true for scholars working on the topic now. And for those who perceive themselves not directly affected, there is the evident narcissistic boost or bonus that is such a central dynamic for all fascisms and all racisms. Meanwhile, disability is unlike others. Those of you who are here this morning to talk with me about that, one of my points all through is that disability is positioned ambivalently in relationship to all other vectors of being. So do the disabled belong to us or to them is a question that comes up over and over again. Are they an ethnic minority? Is that the category, or is it more like a part of the self? With all due attunement to the differences between eugenics and other forms of racism, including anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, and of course to their intricate historical intersections, some of which we talked about this morning, I would urge us to entertain the idea, and I want your opinions on this question. Is eugenics simply one of the forms that racism takes, or is it at least one of racism's dimensions? And is it possible that the virulence of eugenic thinking is fueled not least by a disavowed insecurity on the part of a would-be master race, whether it's white supremacists in the United States or whether it's the master race in Nazi Germany? There's a kind of convulsive compulsion to create that purported perfection and superiority that apparently is not self-evident on its own. 6, reconstructing the evolution of moral political debates over the value of disabled lives, because it intersects different professions and different dimensions, basically has relevance for the histories of medicine and psychiatry, theology and religion, welfare and pedagogy, but also the histories of capitalism and labor and of sexuality and reproduction. So attending to disability is not some marginal add-on. Certainly Germans, in arguing with each other over how to think and feel about, and in practice, how to treat fellow citizens with a diverse range of intellectual impairments and psychiatric diagnoses, worked out over the century and a half since the 1870s, a great deal about their self-understanding as a nation. Okay, that's enough with the preliminaries. Here we go into chapter 2. And you can see this little quote on the side here, which I'll come to later. But just sort of one more comment before I delve into the past. When I began the archival research 4 years ago, summer of 2019, I thought naively that I would study the theology of disability and the evolution of theological concepts of disability over the course of the 20th century, for the very basic reason that a significant percentage of people with cognitive impairments had been sheltered in Christian charity institutions, mostly Protestant, but also Catholic, from the late 19th century on. And because I had been taught, as so many people have, inspiring stories that turn out to be misleading mythologies surrounding protest against euthanasia and protection of people with disabilities against the Nazi onslaught coming from the Christian charities. But the Christians proved to be, with some very precious exceptions, much more of a problem than I could have guessed. And that's what turned into the story. You know, I think that it was so obvious to me 20 years ago when I was working on sex after fascism that Christians have trouble with Jews. But I never had understood that Christians have trouble with the disabled, because I'd absorbed these mythologies that that's what Christians do. They take care of the weak and vulnerable, and those turn out to be post-war lies. Anyway, so with this story, it ends up telling us a lot more about the potent seductive appeal of eugenics and about the genuine difficulties that historical actors experienced in formulating counterpoints or counterpositions to eugenic thinking. Okay. So a slim book published in 1920, just in the wake of the cataclysm of World War I, was entitled, quote, here's my quote marks, "Permission to Annihilate Life Unworthy of Life. Die Freigabe der Vernichtung Lebens und Wertenlebens." It's co-written by a lawyer, Carl Binding, and a psychiatrist, Alfred Hoche. And the book is often invoked. If you go, you know, euthanasia, Nazis, on Wikipedia, you'll get the Binding and Hoche book, right? It's invoked when scholars try to explain the prehistory of the Nazi euthanasia murders. And I think you all know about 210,000 people with psychiatric illnesses or cognitive disabilities were murdered within the German Reich, and another maybe 80,000 in occupied Poland and the Soviet Union. So we're talking close to 300,000 who were murdered. And do not imagine them as blind or deaf or physically crippled, although some of them may have also been those things. It's above all, it's an onslaught against cognitive disability and psychiatric illness. The majority carried the diagnosis schizophrenia, but at that time, that was a big, broad umbrella diagnosis, which would also capture some kinds of cognitive disability. Okay, so people always mention this book, now from 1920. Far less well-studied are the various counterpositions, because in 1920, they said, we want to kill the most severely disabled because they're useless ballast. And so everyone kind of knows that this book existed, but far less well-studied are the various counterpositions proposed by Christian authors, theologians, pastors, and charity institution directors, most of them active in the Inner Mission, Innere Mission, the umbrella organization of all Protestant church welfare work, who during the years of the Weimar Republic strove to argue that Binding and Hoche were wrong, and that killing those demeaningly labeled as life unworthy of life, in quotes, should be considered morally unacceptable. The Christians, now that I've made all these preliminaries, you'll realize had trouble finding convincing words. So first, let's imagine the spaces. From the 1870s on, dozens of Protestant, as well as an increasingly also competitively, a few Catholic institutions had been created and kept expanding to take in ever more individuals with mental disabilities. Many of them from the very poorest classes of society, to provide these individuals with schooling and work training, and especially for those who were unable to be economically self-supporting, above all, safety and care. As the decades unfolded and the 20th century began, the institutions kept ballooning in size, becoming entire villages, whole counterworlds to industrial modernity. But the numbers were not the only problem, so too were attitudes. In the first years of the 20th century, the labor of care for the most vulnerable members of society was, despite the rising challenges, still being assertively promoted by the directors of the institutions as truly God's work, a work that also brought out important virtues in those providing the caring. Yet, between the mid-20s and the early 30s, well before Adolf Hitler ascended to the position of chancellor in January of 33, the confidence in that life-sustaining perspective would be seriously eroded. Indeed, you'll see the particular argumentative logics advanced by Christian critics of Binding and Hoche reveal profound ambivalences within theological and charity circles. Ambivalence about disability as a phenomenon, about individuals with disabilities as human beings, and about the practice of care altogether. So revisiting this corpus of texts produced in response to Binding and Hoche, and seeing there the extraordinary defensiveness that the charity spokesman evinced, the compromise formations they evolved, and their, as you'll see, elaborate reworkings of theological concepts to take economic, quote unquote, biological, and sexual political concerns into account, in turn gives us original perspectives on important dynamics during the Third Reich and its immediate aftermath. We gain new insight into the eagerness with which the Protestant charities participated in the Nazis' coercive program of eugenic sterilizations. There were 400,000 ultimately eugenic sterilizations. The Catholics would express official disapproval, but ultimately they allowed the sterilizations to happen as well. We understand more fully the depth of helplessness when charity directors were faced with the implacable ruthlessness of the regime's intent to implement euthanasia on a mass scale. And not least, in view of this impotent ineffectuality, we come to recognize more comprehensively what was at stake in the self-excusing rationalizations, repressions, and reinterpretations of the immediate horrific past that were produced in the first years after the military defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945. And I just want to say that the reason I had this misunderstanding about Christianity's relationship to disability is because of the mythologies produced in the immediate post-45 period, in which Christian leaders, the Catholics were proud that Bishop von Galen had given his sermon that caused the gas chamber murders to be stopped, and the Protestants could point proudly to one particular institution in which the residents had been saved. And so they could say, look, see, we protected the disabled. And it's almost like that protest and protection functions synecdochally, to stand in, like a synecdoche, right? Just that little piece stood in for the idea of Christian resistance to Nazism, which was almost non-existent, right? I mean, there is a confessing church in the Protestant church that, of course, protests the Nazis' church policy, but does very few exceptions of amazing individuals, does not do a lot for Jews or for the disabled. So the misunderstandings that I and so many people labor under were actively produced in post-45. Okay, then there's two further issues that haunt the debates. This is delicate, but one concerns gradations and divisions among the disabled. Not only was there a stark pecking order among people with different disabilities, with individuals with sensory or physical impairments often insisting on their superiority to individuals with cognitive challenges, but there were strongly perceived, much openly discussed divisions identified amongst those with intellectual disabilities as well. Although the lines would always be fuzzy and the nomenclature varied greatly, at least three broadly distinguishable groups emerged. It may seem offensive to talk about this, but nothing that happened makes sense without acknowledging it. To the one side were those with more minor cognitive challenges or only temporary psychiatric crises, for the most part functioning perfectly well in supervised agricultural or mechanical jobs. To the other side were the institutionalized, living in these buildings. But within this group too, there was a divide between those able to provide labor in and for the institution in some way, you know, mopping the floors or working in the laundry or working in the kitchen or working in the fields, and those who were utterly unable to work and who instead required above all the time investment and labor of care from others. This theme of, quote, work capacity, the German word is Arbeitsfähigkeit, or lack thereof, was eventually to have the gravest implications. And then there's the second delicate issue. What would become by the later years of Weimar and early Third Reich, a much promoted media-fueled spiraling, this is what a lot of psychic energy is put into convincing people of this, of public resentment around the supposedly lavish conditions in which the most severely intellectually disabled people lived. There were fantastic fictions, what was called welfare luxury, Wohlfahrtsluxus, purportedly enjoyed by the non-working disabled. In actuality, hid a more complicated materiality. A facility's debt burden, its tax-exempt status, the size of its endowment. Whenever I think about this, I think about the pressure under which public universities are now, right, where budgets are constantly being cut and everybody scrambles. I mean, how are we going to find more donors and all those things? That's what these institutions were also going through. So debt burden, tax-exempt status, size of endowment, annual level of philanthropic donations, proportion of private pay, full tuition versus to publicly funded residents, how low the salaries for staff can be kept. All of these matters were existential for the care institutions and inevitably reached directly into the corporeal and psychic experiences, especially of the most vulnerable residents. But as it happens, a considerable number of larger institutions augmented the small daily per resident allotments they received from the state with the labor power of the residents. So the most economically valuable were the contributions of institutionally affiliated worker colonies. So when you see large fields that were then bought up by these institutions in their area surrounding them, they're trying to basically grow all the food for the institution. And a lot of that is then offered to homeless men, get housing in exchange for the agricultural other land work. But a vital additional source which keeps these places running is the work of the, quote, moderately disabled residents, even as the labor they provided was presented and no doubt experienced by many as therapeutic in fields and garden, kitchen, laundry, sheltered workshops, or around the grounds. Later, when mass murder was at its height, the entire system of both care and killing, which are happening simultaneously, continued to depend on the labor of people with disabilities. How this point has gotten lost from memory and is yet to be appropriately integrated into the scholarship on the history of eugenics and euthanasia is a matter to which I will return. So there's 4 parts. Part 1, it's called Permission to Annihilate. Here we go. This is the little bookie that I talked about. Coming as Binding and Hoch's text did in the wake of the mass carnage of World War I, in which so many had died on the battlefield, and a majority of the civilian population too had been exposed to hunger and deprivation, and the economy remained devastated, their insistence for both emotional and economic reasons that the profoundly disabled should be disposed of gained great public attention and acclaim. The combination of emotions and economics was crucial, as Binding and Hoche played on feelings of revulsion at disability, but also emphasized disability's financial cost to the taxpayer. Although the bulk of their text blurred pain relief eventuating in death with deliberate killing and extemporized at length about assisted suicide. There's a reason why to this day debates in Germany about assisted suicide keep getting tangled up with the euthanasia murders, because this text tangled them on purpose. The main aim of the brochure lay in a small subplot. Binding, the lawyer, was candid in his view with respect to the group he labeled, quote, incurable idiots. And I'm just trust me, I'm always putting this in quotation marks with my fingers and hopefully with my intonation. Indignant that years and decades of the valuable time and labor of caregivers were being spent on these persons, Binding averred that, quote, you see it there, I can find neither from the legal, nor the social, nor the moral, nor the religious standpoint any grounds whatsoever not to permit the killing of these humans, who arouse horror in almost everyone who encounters them. Hoche, for his part, reinforced this position, he's the psychiatrist, with mathematical calculations as to the money expended every year on food, clothing, and heating for, quote, the total idiots, whose numbers he estimated nationally in the tens of thousands, of which he thought the, quote, mentally completely dead constituted approximately 3,000 to 4,000. In Hoche's view, these people were ballast existences. They're the ones who coined this term, ballast existence, and nothing but dead weight burdening a struggling society. So this book, Permission to Annihilate, Life Unworthy of Life, provoked a redirection of the German national discussion. Binding had opened the pamphlet with a direct attack on Christianity for what he deemed to be its cruelty in rejecting the notion of assisted suicide. So that's like a gambit that he uses. Binding took offense at what he called, quote, the impure idea that the God of love could wish that a person would only be permitted to die after enduring unending bodily or spiritual torments. Religious leaders took notice. Their institutions were among the primary homes for the class of humans whose right to stay alive was now under attack. And their institutions were indeed, particularly in the immediate aftermath of World War I, in considerable financial stress. But more than that, the very enterprise of Christian charity caregiving was increasingly being represented as responsible for the looming death of the German folk. So care itself is being represented as killing, specifically because of its tendency to engage in, quote, artificial nurturance of the less than healthy, because that was deemed contra-selective in the social Darwinian sense. Binding and Hoche's proposals were devastating to the still prevailing sentimental paradigm of care that had animated the work of the intermission from its beginnings. At the Alsterdorfer Anstalten, there in Hamburg, the founding director, Heinrich Matthias Engelmann, that's him, regularly spoke of the importance of salvific love, saving love. He titled his book, Idiotophilos, the lover of a friend of idiots. And in addressing fellow directors at what turned out to be triannual conferences, and I've read through all their conference discussions, he boldly professed that in the institution's labor of care, quote, we are not dealing with cases, medical cases, but with fellow human beings in whom also an immortal soul is alive, even if it is veiled from us. At the legendary and largest institution, Bethel, like House of God, right? Bethel. It's near Bielefeld. You can see how it becomes an entire village, right? Its founder, Friedrich von Bodelschwingh, a pietism-influenced Lutheran pastor, worked yet more tirelessly to alter popular attitudes toward both physical and cognitive handicaps. Bethel's specialty is actually epilepsy, but as a result, they end up having a lot of people with cognitive handicaps as well, and they also have psychiatrically ill people. In his sermons and other writings, von Bodelschwingh wrestled recurrently with the stark and agonizing questions that disability, whether inborn or acquired, posed to an individual and his or her family. This is like the questions of Job. This is a theodicy question, like, why me? Why does this happen? Was it a sign of some moral failing? Was it a test from God? Von Bodelschwingh's own answers were rooted in his particular brand of reverent faith, one feature of which was his conviction that all people, himself included, were bound up in sin, as was the whole world, and hence the confrontation with illness was always again a prompt to strive to be even more self-critically penitent. Okay, so he does have this idea that maybe there was some sin somewhere, and we need to be confronting that and judging ourselves and trying even harder to be good. Nonetheless, his most persistent reaction in the face of any need was to attempt to alleviate suffering and to emphasize the privilege of serving those who were most helpless. Like one of his favorite slogans where he told his deaconesses, you have to imagine sort of Protestant nuns, right? They're people who give vows of chastity and service, who are doing a lot of the care. He always tells them, don't the lowest path is the safest. So this idea that it's a privilege, wir dürfen dienen, it is a great thing that God allows us, or Jesus allows us to be helping these other people, that's the message he's communicating. But especially significant from the point of view of the history of disability were von Bodelschwingh's efforts to destigmatize and de-shame and to undo reflexive reactions of emotional physical revulsion at deformation and profound vulnerability. His Bote von Bethel, Messenger from Bethel, the newsletter, so it's at once a fundraising tool and a pious instruction pamphlet, of which thousands of copies were sent all over the nation, deliberately printed photographs of individuals in his care, which he described in the most affectionate and affirmative terms. Moreover, and however mawkishly, he portrayed these individuals in all their visible non-normativity as great inspirations for the healthy. Not just, though also, because providing loving care for them brought out the best values in the non-disabled caregivers, though that too, but above all, because the disabled themselves were true models in their capacity to express joy and gratitude. We can and we should talk about the also gag-worthy aspects of the sentimentality, but in practice, it was not an ineffective defense. Von Bodelschwingh, as did his son, who took over the directorship in 1910, did not hide from public view those disabled people who would never be able to do any kind of productive work. And father and son both made very clear that they saw beauty in them. Yet World War I marked a turning point. Government rationing led to widespread hunger in the later years of the war, also at many institutions affiliated with the intermission, and tens of thousands of disabled individuals perished. One estimate speaks of 140,000 institutionalized residents dead from hunger, infectious disease, and inadequate care. Karl Bonhoeffer, the father of Dietrich, the first chairman of the German Association for Psychiatry, noted summarily in 1919, after the war, in a tone of worry, not of endorsement, that many had privately, quote, almost condoned the fact that by these sacrifices, in other words, these people dying, more resources remain for the preservation of the healthy. Binding and Hacha's pamphlets systematized the demand to a shift to active killing. Okay, part 2 is Like a Temptation. And this guy, Friedrich Lensch here, he's the successor to the Idiotophilus authoring Sengelmann at the Alsterdorfer Anstalten in Hamburg. He would summarize the situation as it was evolving over the course of the 1920s. Quote, the objections to keeping the severely disabled alive can be subdivided into 3 groups. The first are economic, the second, the eugenic type, the third are generally humanitarian. The economic argument, he said, in an explicit gesture to Binding and Hacha's concept of the balanced existences, could be refuted fairly easily, since Protestant charities like his, he proudly explained, were extremely cost efficient. The eugenic argument, he averred, had always already been a concern of the intermission since the mid-19th century, and that was precisely why institutionalization was so important, because it keeps the disabled out of sexual circulation. In other words, they're not making babies because they're in sex-segregated institutions, and provided a source base of subjects for medical research into feeble-mindedness in the expectation that its prevalence could be reduced in the future. So that's one of the strategies the Christians use, is they to say, oh, we've been eugenic all along. And then there were the, quote, humanitarian objections, the notion that the lives of the disabled must be unbearable for them. Ultimately, Lensch argues that his residents loved life and that it would be, quote, cowardly to kill them. But not before he had, with rather alarming candor, confessed that, quote, you see it here, those who tore our institution, always again shaken, ask us if one cannot, if only for the sake of the ill ones themselves, liberate them from this life that can, after all, hardly be called life. I freely admit that I felt no differently when I first came in, and these thoughts also creep up on us again and again, like a temptation. His was hardly an anomalous voice. The 1920s saw an outpouring of commentary from theologians, pastors, and welfare institution directors as they all reacted to the Binding and Hacha pamphlet. The possibility of proactively murdering the most severely disabled hovered around the edges of all these conversations. And what evolved was a new way of speaking, a kind of theo-biopolitics or theo-bioeconomics, one in which religious and moral considerations got confused with financial ones, with issues of biological bodily health or disease got thoroughly remuddled with questions of guilt and sin itself changed its meanings and became understood in new ways. So some of the responses to Binding and Hacha were to end up being published in a book with the title, The Problem of Abbreviating Life Unworthy of Life, by a man named Ewald Meltzer, who was a Protestant doctor, who was director of the Katharinenhof, which is one of those massive institutions in what then became communist East Germany. It's near Czechoslovakia, Poland, or what was then Czech Republic and Poland, and it's still on the far eastern corner of Germany. Meltzer, in the language of the era, a, quote, universally beloved father of the imbeciles, was intent on compiling all possible arguments, both religious and secular, against murdering the disabled. The purpose of this book is to compile arguments against murder. But he also cataloged the breadth of arguments in favor of murder. And here in this book, we learn, this is 1925, we learn of Protestant religious leaders endorsing murder of the most seriously disabled as morally acceptable. They have very creative arguments for why murder is okay. And we find that a noted religious educator in the town of Auerbach in Saxony averred that, quote, as long as abbreviating life is done out of benevolence, Wohlwollen, it was not immoral. A theology professor in Heidelberg opined that although an individual Christian may not kill, a state may, especially when it came to the more severely disabled individuals whose soul life has not been raised above the plant or animal level. He's actually known as a conservative biblical pietist. And a prominent Protestant professor in Berlin, Arthur Titius at the very end there, felt that the elimination of such nuclei or sprouts, Keime, so he means severely disabled individuals who are not fully developed, right? The elimination of such nuclei or spouts could in fact be compatible with full love of God and genuine humanitarianism. End of quote. None of these men had close, continuous contact with individuals with disabilities, but their arguments, unsurprisingly, provided religious legitimation for Binding and Hoche's position. Commentators who were directly involved in care work, by contrast, were at pains in their texts to declare themselves opposed to killing. You know, it's against the Bible, you're not supposed to kill, like they're clear about that. And yet their texts often and peculiarly amplified rather than challenged a sense of revulsion towards the most severely disabled. And simultaneously, they dragged in the moderately disabled as well, who had figured not at all in Binding and Hoche's pamphlet. These commentators took the opportunity of public interest in the theme of disability to elaborate a variety of connecting links between disability and sin and sex, expanding the conversation to bring in their concerns also about the more moderately disabled. So, for example, much mid to late 20s response to Binding and Hoche pseudo-scientifically sourced disability as being a result of the sexual disorder of the Weimar Republic. Binding and Hoche had not mentioned sex. It took their self-defined Christian opponents to introduce the idea that there was, as one author put it, a connection, indeed a tight one, between idiocy and sin. A welfare institution director in Magdeburg with a doctorate in theology in 1925 offered as evidence for his own expertise and familiarity with thousands of, quote, abnormals that, quote, they resemble vegetating clumps of flesh whose expressions of life consist in nothing more than eating, drinking, elimination, and sleeping. In other words, he confirmed in his own words that the severely disabled were indeed lesser beings, inferior, gross, and disgusting, and also time and labor consuming and expensive. But not content to leave it at that, raging against, quote, animal rutting, tierische Punst, he additionally took the occasion to argue that, quote, the worst sources of lesser value progeny are those vices of the folk, alcoholism, and sexual aberrations. And his rationale for why these, quote, lesser value progeny should not be eliminated was because they would serve as living reminders to their parents to feel, quote, somehow guilty, knowing as they do that so much wretchedness is the result of heredity. So in other words, if the disabled were to be killed, consciences would be numbed, and then people would just return to having more sex and producing more disability. Also, those who made a point of incorporating some sentimental defense of the severely disabled joined in the chorus of lament about the only moderately disabled and their purportedly sexually errant ways. As one Berlin-based theologian involved in welfare work observed, even the most severely disabled individuals nonetheless could have a redemptive effect on those around them. Yet for this author too, needs to talk about those moderate people, the feeble-minded and psychopaths are expanding frighteningly as their sexual drive life is stronger. The death of the folk will soon be inescapable, for the very existence of welfare care, charity care that he himself engages in, is allowing, quote, everything withered, crippled, ailing to keep growing, and then it combines itself with the healthy, produces sick progeny, and causes immeasurable damage. In a Beetle-based publication, it's like a little pamphlet, and that got circulated and recommended to everyone at all the other institutions. A pastor director from Saxony-Anhalt offered a yet more intricate version of this associative constellation. There's just like an accrual of emotional intensities here. Quote, if there was no addiction to alcohol, no brothel and no venereal diseases, no overabundance of lust and no submersion in vice, then most of the institutions of the intermission could close their doors. In other words, they wouldn't have any clients. Again, this argument he's making is an argument against Binding and Hoche. So as he continues, because the world is the way it is, and because our folk simply is the way it has become, that is why there are idiots and epileptics and cretins and people ill with venereal diseases and tuberculosis and the cripples and the insane. This author was particularly indignant that, quote, the media Jews, die Pressejuden, the dirty joke writers and the real estate speculators, the stock exchange jobbers, and the whole pleasure-craving populace that knows nothing more than insipid amusements and hot fashions and tawdry wit, all of them should live? while the poor newborn children that have been put into the world by this adulterous generation, and which carry the sins of the parents for the rest of their lives, would, he says indignantly, if Binding and Hoche's recommendations were to be followed, be put to death. So it's complicated, it's a tangled argument, but in this defense of the moral innocence of the disabled, the causal connection could not be more explicit. The purported pervasiveness of sexual dissoluteness and sin was here blamed on the inducements of the media Jews, among others, and that dissoluteness and sin were proffered as explanation for how disabled people are produced. So sinful sex is the cause of cognitive disability. That's the message that's being put out there. While there was certainly a kernel of sense and logic in the evidence that venereal diseases could cause birth defects, leaders in the intermission evinced a far more global and diffuse dislike for what they saw as proliferating sexual profligacy. Okay, part 3. It's called compromise formation. Okay, the rising consensus about the degraded value of disabled lives was to find yet fuller expression in the Tria resolution of 1931. So Tria is this little town north of Frankfurt. It's growing out of a meeting in May of that year at which 22 leading figures from the intermission gathered to discuss eugenics and euthanasia. And the results of their deliberations, right, which is 2 years before Hitler comes to power, right? The results of their deliberations would be published shortly thereafter, come to take the form of a kind of Christian charity policy platform. I mean, it's understood in religious history as the turning point in which Protestant charity shifts from meeting the needs of individuals to an explicitly eugenic orientation. Among other things, and we have to keep the material context in mind, it's not just a world of ideas, right? It's very specifically in response to reductions in per person subsidies instigated by the now budget-strapped Prussian state. This resolution proposed that differential care, differenzierte Fürsorge, would henceforth be provided to those among their disabled charges who were, due to severe cognitive or psychiatric impairment, unable to engage in productive labor. In other words, these Protestant leaders, 10 of them theologians and pastors, the others were like physician, social worker, teacher, and lawyer, would at Tria formally endorse a hierarchization of value. In other words, those who cannot work should not be cared for as intensively. In addition, a succinct version of another of the resolution's conclusions turned out to be a kind of theological compromise formation. Murder, no. Sterilization, yes. Sterilization had previously been rejected by the majority of people in the intermission on the grounds that an intellectually challenged, sterilized female would either no longer have a reason not to become promiscuous or would be vulnerable to male exploitation and rapaciousness. And they had a certain notion of how heterosexuality worked, as sexual conservatism had provided the foundational grid of intelligibility for churchmen's decision-making. But under growing pressure to consider murder, resistance to sterilizations dissolved. Or as the resolution put it, we do not want to eliminate the victims of guilt and sin, but to attempt to prevent them. In other words, worth noting here is the blatant implication that disabled progeny are somehow the result of guilt and sin. Then again, however, the causation goes in the other direction. As one fresh reason given here for the importance of sterilizing, they're suddenly convincing themselves that sterilization is a good thing. To be fair, they believe in voluntary sterilization. They are not advocating coercive sterilization, but at least they're deciding that sterilization is okay. That sterilizing within a body's God-given functions might lead to evil, and hence there's not only a right, but a moral duty to sterilize out of neighborly love. And then here you sort of see the shift from serving the individual to suddenly the full collectivity in the future. Quote, out of the responsibility which has been imposed on us, not just for the generation that exists already, but also for the coming generation. So you can sort of see how what Christian love means has kind of shifted its meaning, right? I mean, it used to be loving people no matter how vulnerable and emphasizing joy and care. And now suddenly it means we're going to sterilize them out of love. And once more, there were the side swipes at the sexual culture of Weimar. Quote, brothel keepers were far worse vermin than the physical and mental invalids. But of course, they're still saying that physical and mental invalids are vermin, right? Yet although Binding and Hoche, and they cite them by name, everybody's still responding to this pamphlet 11 years later, right? Were repudiated for assuming that, quote, there's no soul life among the severely disabled. They think there is. Nonetheless, the aversion that Bindingen had articulated against individuals with disabilities was confirmed and restirred. So, quote, it's the yellow quote, shattering like almost no other thing, the sight of these ailing and miserable beings admonishes the healthy person to keep his body unscathed and pure and become conscious of his deep responsibility when he founds a family. In other words, the case for keeping the disabled alive was that doing so provided a valuable lesson in chastity for the non-disabled. Because people are going to be so horrified that then they'll avoid getting venereal diseases and so on. By 1933, 2 years later, when the Nazis assumed the reins of government and passed their overtly coercive and expansive sterilization law, the Protestant leaders of the inner mission signed off on it, or even declared quickly that they had been in favor of sterilization all along. They also began enthusiastically to sterilize. At Protestant hospitals and at charitable institutions for the disabled, a regular routine was established. At Bethel, for instance, with literally a weekly sterilization day, and the doctors could hardly keep up. Institutions were encouraged to develop card catalogs and clan charts, identifying individual and familial vulnerabilities. More generally, let me see if I've got a picture of that. No, here. Yeah, okay, but let's go back to this. More generally, disability care institutions warmly welcomed the Third Reich. In fulsome terms, directors embraced the rise of Nazism, expressing appreciation that the new government had effectively broken, this is a quote, effectively broken the influence of that Jewish liberalism that is totally hostile to the Gospels. Or in another quote, Hitler's strong hand has intervened and brought an end to the liberal Marxist era, which was leading to Bolshevism, the Jewish dictatorship. Photographs of gatherings of individuals with disabilities, whether accompanied by their caregiving deaconesses amid swastika flags, I don't know if you can see it, right? There's little, here. This is the swastika flag here or there, right? And here is the swastika inside the basket that's being woven, right? Swastika woven in a handmade basket and an in-house sheltered workshop conveyed the climate with special poignancy. And yeah, here. And while some Protestant spokespeople remain skeptical of coercive sterilization, and what is their skepticism based in? It's because it will remove one of the strongest arguments for the need for long-term institutionalization of the purportedly wayward, right? Because like if they're sterilized, then they could run around outside. And although they wouldn't be able to make babies anymore, they would be doing bad sexual things. Once the sterilization law passed, churchmen and charity doctors actually rushed to develop further religious justifications for sterilization, cheering that, let me see if I can find, no, here it is, cheering that the liberalistic slogan of the right of the human being to his own body, that's what they associate with Weimar, has been thoroughly undone by this law. One pastor celebrated, quote, all enthusiasm for the Third Reich and its Führer. God himself has given this government the power. In sum, in their efforts to come up with reasons not to condone murder, Protestants settled on the compromise idea of effusive endorsement of sterilizations, and so ended up not just eugenicizing theology, but theologizing eugenics. Because they hoped to maintain their cultural status, keep their institutions afloat, because they all along evidently had unresolved ambivalence about their own work, the very people who had the disabled in their care cast aspersions on them and formulated in the name of Christianity a novel means of denigration. In other words, far from providing a vigorous, robust alternative to Bindingenhofer's cost benefit and emotional revulsion arguments that demanded killing, the Protestant leaders in their opposition intensified anti-disability animus. Let that go by for a minute. Okay. These are all the different killing methods, and you see the T4 centers. Many of them had been sanatoria, with one exception. One was a prison, but the others had all been places of healing and care before they became homes of gas chambers. And then in the second decentralized phase of the euthanasia killings, it's done by poison or medication overdose or systematic starvation. So you can see the weights dropping over time. Okay, the Nazi Disability Murder Project, as it developed momentum from 1939 on, had many components: mass shootings and gas vans, 30 special children's wards, quote unquote, 6 T4 gas chambers running from January of 1940 to August of 41, the second decentralized phase of killing by medication overdose or deliberate starvation with double the death toll. Over and over, the killings that were most brazenly pursued were directed at those requiring labor of care from others, rather than being able to provide labor themselves, even as the bar for what was needed to be allowed to survive kept rising. Here you see a patient in Hadamar in the second phase, looking, basically having a Nazi devil doing injections and killing people, like the patients knew what was going on. So thus, for instance, as I mentioned earlier, the ability to peel potatoes or mop floors, to weave mats or glue paper bags was counted as mechanical rather than productive work, and increasingly deemed insufficient for keeping a person alive. So over time, the Nazi leadership gets wise to the idea that the institutions are trying to argue, well, this person mops floors for us or can peel potatoes, and therefore they are doing work, and therefore they should be kept alive. And they say, no, that doesn't count. And this is one of the later deportations, ultimately, from one of the religious charity institutions. More generally, the intricacies surrounding these core economic issues of work capacity and labor power never stopped mattering. This led to countless hallucinatory, grotesque scenes. So, for example, an administrator at the charity institution of Stetten in Württemberg, it's near Stuttgart, arguing with deportation personnel at the very door of the gray buses meant to take the victims to the gas chamber, that he absolutely needed to keep his faithful cook, Lena L., otherwise he would be obliged to replace her with, quote, a person of fully sound mind. So you have to imagine really these concrete scenes of people trying to save some of their own and then having the transport personnel take them away. Or disabled residents at an institution near Heidelberg, it's called Wieslach, doing all the labor in kitchen and laundry to sustain care for wounded Wehrmacht soldiers who by that point in the war inhabited the beds freed by an earlier round of killings. Right, so you have to imagine an institution in which the inmates are doing all the care work for actually Wehrmacht soldiers. A disabled man helping with the corpse burning in a crematorium in Bavaria, or psychiatrically ill patients at the murder center of Meseritz-Oberwalde, who were tasked each morning with collecting the past night's dead on a little wagon to bring them to the morgue. Or disabled residents at the Kalmenhof and at Hadamar in Hessen, those are two different institutions in Hessen, forced to help in the killings, holding down fellow patients while they were being injected with poison. And a disabled man, this is one of my most intense stories, still living at Hadamar, which is near Frankfurt. It's one of the T4 killing centers in the 1980s, the little man with the harmonica, recalling how he had assisted with the digging of mass graves on the hill above the asylum during the decentralized phase of murders there, and was still able, 40 years later, to describe exactly the space needed to make the graves the correct size. In the first post-war decades, and this is from the 1950s, he just still lives in the institution and everybody knows him in town. No one had wanted to hear this man disclose his experience. He was best known in and around the institution's grounds for playing the harmonica. How did Christian charities navigate this nightmare? The entire pathos and complexity of the Protestant intermission's relationship to the Nazi murder of the disabled is encapsulated in the experiences at the asylum of Stetten. That's the one near Stuttgart. Okay, this is actually Grafeneck. It's one of the T4 centers then in Württemberg near there. Over the course of the fall of 1940, gray buses appeared in the courtyard of Stetten to cart away in a series of successive Tuesdays 323 feeble-minded and epileptic of the original 742 residents of the institution, so as to take them to be murdered in a carbon monoxide T4 gas chamber housed in a garage. That's this thing here, which was later dismantled. So you have to picture from the time at the killing center of Grafeneck, which is basically this glorious castle where the perpetrators are partying and having a wonderful time. It's an hour and a half northwest. A further 11 were later killed at Hadamar during its T4 phase, and an unknown number met their deaths in a series of, quote, relocations during the second decentralized phase. The survivors, needless to say, were severely traumatized. Those who were left behind, the 400 who still lived there, but 300 were taken away. Run, there again, you can see the village effect, right? Run since 1930 by the pastor Ludwig Schleich, an active and well-networked member of the intermission. The atmosphere at Stetten provides a perfect exemplar of the indissoluble blend of compliance and contestation with the government, the Nazi government, and ultimately the wrenching non-choices characterizing so many charity institutions in the Third Reich. Schleich did not become a Nazi Party member, but his deputy did, as did his head doctor, the finance officer, and one of the house fathers. Schleich expressly encouraged NSDAP educational events among his staff. He took the staff to Stuttgart to see a Nazi exhibit on Bolshevism. He allowed Hitler Youth to use the castle spaces. He gave a lecture already in 1933, stating that, quote, racial mixing and Jewish Christian marriages should be outlawed. And he both affirmed the Nazi sterilization law and implemented it without any hesitation among his charges, 184 of them between 1934 and 1940. Alert as early as 1937, so 4 years into the Third Reich, that his tax-free status, here we are with the money theme, his tax-free status as a charity would be endangered by the fact that he had 3 Jewish residents, including one man who had lived in Stettin for nearly 60 years. He tried to get them moved out, but failed. The old man stayed until he was deported to the gas at Grafeneck with the other residents. And yet, Schleich cherished his patients. Schleich expressly and vigorously repudiated talk of use value and productivity. Schleich argued about the disabled that through their existence, they awaken our love. Drafted into the Wehrmacht, Schleich was not present when the first reporting forms, these Meldeformulare that were sent by the government to all the institutions. He was not there when they first arrived at the institution, but when he returned to Stettin and was confronted by the demand to turn over his own beloved patients, he mobilized very quickly, entering into grueling negotiations with regional authorities, marshaling every imaginable religious and secular argument against murder. He writes to all different government leaders. He urges kin to rescue patients by bringing them home, and he later bargains with transport personnel at the door of the buses in the hopes of turning them away, and in some cases trying to save those he could. He never forgave himself for failing. He published an anguished book in 1947. As a historical document, there's nothing like it. It's modeled in some indicative ways, sexual conservatism, in the predictable intermission ways, but lebensunwert, unworthy of life, is nonetheless a landmark text. It's a book of sorrow over lives lost and resistance that was insufficient. And it's unique in that it incorporates the voices of the victims and survivors. That's very unusual, and captures their experiences of terror. In these testimonials, what is communicated are the victims and survivors' deep attachments to their caregivers, but also with each other. So there are several stories of wanting to die together with friends, and above all, their acute awareness of the fate awaiting them. Some can only shriek or sob or try to run. A survivor in a wheelchair said, quote, "Who will hide me? Who would be my advocate? With me, one can see already from far away that I'm a useless eater." One woman writes to her family, quote, "When they come and take one by the collar, I sure am not a weakling, that is clear, but I would not believe it if I had not seen it with my own eyes. This is all true, what I am telling. The government no longer wants so many institutions, and us they want to be rid of." In another text, Schleich reports on one man who could not be saved, who shouts to his nurse, "We'll see each other again in heaven." But to the personnel that had come from him, he screamed in their faces, "Our blood be upon you." Schleich demanded recognition for the survivors of the T4 action, and he may have been the first to do so. I'm pretty sure he is. Anyway, he also declared this: "The psychiatrically ill, the feeble-minded, and the epileptics have truly also belonged to the persecutees of the Third Reich. Who can deny this? But where is someone, where are the political parties, where the state that will intercede so that those who have escaped this terrible extermination action and its terrors can receive reparations? They cannot raise their own voices. They are in the political battles of our days. No power factor that one might fear or that one could leverage on their behalf. That is why no one also today, just as in the days of the Third Reich, considers them worthy of being paid attention to say nothing of fulfilling their rights for justice." End of quote. It would take ultimately 4 decades to make this case that Schleich had made, that the sterilizations and the euthanasia killings had been crimes against human beings. That was the argument that took 4 decades to make. Crimes that deserve to be prosecuted, to be memorialized, and to be integrated into the history of the nation. It took a lot of amazing activism to teach an entire society to treat individuals with disabilities as full human beings. I would say that probably took 5 or 6 decades. That historical process of unlearning eugenics is the bigger story that I'm working on. And yeah, we'll talk more this afternoon, but thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dagmar. This was